Hello, and a very warm welcome to a new season of the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. My name is Simon Brew from Film Stories magazine, and this is a regular podcast celebrating one of the biggest and deepest film libraries in the world. STUDIOCANAL's extensive library of over 6,000 films brings together cinema from around the globe. There's comedy with Whiskey Galore and In the Loop, modern acclaimed favourites such as Hell or High Water and Manchester by the Sea. Plus, there are classics from the late great David Lynch with The Elephant Man and Mulholland Drive. This episode, it's a British comic genius that's in the spotlight, Toney Hancock. Famed for his hugely successful television work, he had few ventures into cinema, but he did have two notable attempts to become a big screen leading man. 1961's The Rebel and 1963's The Punch and Judy Man. They're two very different films, both of which are getting fresh DVD and Blu-ray releases. The Rebel, penned by his regular collaborators, the superb writers Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, sees Hancock as a self-taught artist whose enthusiasm, significantly outweighs his ability. The Rebel was close to Hancock's television persona, but The Punch and Judy Man significantly less so. Here, Toney Hancock, as the title suggests, is a Punch and Judy performer in an unhappy marriage, but who gets an opportunity to very much see how the other half live. One of the contributors to the DVD and Blu-ray releases is no stranger to brilliant comedy himself, Paul Merton, and he joined me in the studio to talk about both films, all while wearing a terrific pair of socks. Just to set the scene, here's a taste of Toney Hancock in The Rebel.
Will Monsieur order now?
Well, hang on, I'm only halfway through the soups. Eggs and chips, please.
Does the menu appeal to Monsieur? May I recommend escargot?
Escargot?
They're snails.
Oh! Yes, snails, egg and chips.
Snails, eggs and chips.
And a cup of tea.
And a cup of tea.
I'm delighted to be joined for this episode of STUDIOCANAL Presents. Live in the studio with me, the very warm room, it's Paul Merton. Hello, Paul Merton.
Hello there, how are you today?
All right, thank you very much. We put the radiators on for you.
It's very warm in here and it's very cold outside, so
yes.
This is the right way round.
So we start every episode of this just trying to get a little fact about you. Just something like the first film that you ever remember going to see at the cinema, something along those lines.
Let me see, the first film I remember going to see, I remember I can't be sure entirely about which was the first film. It's maybe in the Walt Disney film, The Sword in the Stone, the cartoon.
Okay.
Possibly Carry On Jack, which again was around about the same era, one of the Carry On films.
Yeah.
And The Punch and Judy Man, one of the Hancock films we're talking today, that would have been fairly early as well, because they were all around about the same year. So I don't know exactly which one was the first, but it'd probably be one of those three.
I mean, you're a very young man, so for you to see The Punch and Judy Man at such a young age, and we will come to the film, that's quite a striking film to be one of your first cinema trips.
Yes, I think my mother used to take me, so I'm sure it was her sort of instinct to do that. Not mine, because I don't even know that I was aware of who Toney Hancock was at that point.
Yeah.
Because the TV shows that he did, the last series was in 61, I think, so I would have been about 4 at the time, 4 or 5, so that would be too young for me.
So Toney Hancock is clearly the heart of the conversation we're going to have. For those who haven't yet been exposed to his work or are unfamiliar with him, and I come from a city where there's a statue of him.
Birmingham,
absolutely right. Yeah. Can you just briefly introduce him to people?
Well, the first thing I would say was, if you wanted to sort of get into the essence of Toney Hancock, I would listen to the radio shows, the Galton and Simpson shows, because the TV shows he made came out of the radio series, and for a while the Galton and Simpson, Ray and Alan, were writing the radio series and the TV series, and the TV programmes were in no way adaptations of radio shows, they were unique on their own. But the TV shows were made at a time from the sort of late 50s onwards where technically it was quite basic stuff for television. So, it's a bit rough and ready. So I would come to the TV shows after I'd listened to the radio, because the radio shows being sound, being audio. Technically, they're perfect. And Toney, I think, was at his best when he was reading from a script in his hand rather than having to learn something. Because when he tried to learn something, he had difficulty with that. So when they were making the TV shows, technically it was very difficult because they shot in 10-minute takes. So if somebody made a mistake within that 10 minutes, they had to go back to the beginning again.
Right.
And start again in that 10-minute take. That's very basic technology. So in the TV shows, you get, there's lots of mistakes here and there, people forgetting words or the camera's in the wrong place and all that sort of stuff. But the radio shows, as I say, because Toney was given the script on the Sunday, he would come in and record on the Sunday. His reading of the script, which everybody always talked about, was so superb that the best of Toney Hancock, other than the Rebel film, the best of Toney Hancock is the radio shows. So I would start with those.
I'd say the same of Alan Partridge. For the same reason. It's just like take the pictures away and it's just focusing on the words. Those early Radio 4 Partridge shows are absolutely sublime. So we're here talking about two films,
Yes.
The Rebel and The Punch and Judy Man. He had done a film before that. I think Orders Are Orders. I think he just appeared. But this was a big thing, The Rebel, wasn't it?
Yes. So Toney had become, through the radio series and through the TV series, sort of perhaps Britain's biggest TV comic at that point.
Yeah.
He was never much of a live comic. He stuck to the same act for decades. But as a TV comic and a radio comic, and radio was still very big in the 50s, he was undoubtedly a big star. And it seemed the next logical move, the next sort of area to conquer, the next world to invade would be the world of cinema. So Galton and Simpson, Ray and Allen wrote a magnificent script, I thought, and The Rebel was made in 1960.
Even in like the 80s and 90s, Toney Hancock was such a name that the BBC was putting repeats on.
Yes.
I remember watching them with my dad at prime time. They weren't tucked away, were they? But when I put The Rebel on and watched that for the first time, it was really jarring at first, seeing
it was in
colour.
Yes.
It's interesting that the two films he made, the second one was in black and white, the first one was in colour. But, I mean, it's beautiful. I mean...
Well, I think the restoration, they've done a brilliant job because for years, The Rebel was available on DVD. And this is a conversation I had with Alan Simpson, one of the writers. And I sort of pointed out to him that the colour had faded quite a bit on the DVD copy that you could get. It was a lot of... The red seemed to be the predominant colour.
Yeah.
And what I hadn't realised as well at that time, until I saw the restored version, is that the picture had been cropped as well. So you were sort of missing approximately, a quarter of the picture. So when we had a show in a couple of years ago, when it was first released as a Blu-ray restoration, with the Prince Charles Cinema here in London, I showed the audience the first minute of the old version.
Right.
And then I said, okay, now this is now what it looks like. And so you see him coming up the stairs at the railway station, you see the colour of the train coming through, and people gasped at the quality of it, because it does look absolutely sensational now, and I think it's such a good film that it has deserved this restoration, and I think it's one of the best British comedies ever made as a film, one of the best British film comedies ever made, and now it looks like it as well.
So you dropped in the names Galton and Simpson, who I know you worked with as well. In terms of their work, would you say that this was the best of it?
I'd say, in terms of all the film scripts they wrote, I'd put this up at the top, really. There is another one that they did with Peter Sellers called The Wrong Arm of the Law, which they didn't write the plot for, but they wrote the dialogue for, and that's very, very good. And I like that as well. There's this line as a reference to a 1960s detective. Oh no, I think it was remade recently, but at one point Peter Sellers, as the crook, taps his head and says with his finger, and says, "I've got things going on in here that make Maygrave drop his pipe." And I used to I used to have lunch with Ray and Allen 3 or 4 times a year, and I always mentioned that line, after a couple of glasses of wine, and they always found that very funny, and it was a very funny line. But I think The Rebel is the scene between Toney Hancock and Irene Handel when she first bursts into his studio.
Yes.
There's 3 minutes of just wonderful jokes, wonderful lines, This is a self-portrait. Who of? Laurel and Hardy, and it's sort of stuff like that. And, then she looks at the sort of grotesque sort of sculpture that he's made, and he says, "This is women as I see them." He says, "You poor bloke, fancy knocking about with women who look like that. I wonder what your kids would look like." So it's a brilliant scene, and it's full of really good stuff. And when we showed it to an audience about 2 or 3 years ago now, it was laughs all the way through. It is a stunningly good film.
It is that 3 minutes, isn't it? I mean, we talk about stuff like Airplane, Naked Gun, appreciating the tone of theirs is spoof, but kind of the machine gun comedy. It's just well-worked line after well-worked line in that.
So you saw it for the first time, last week?
I saw it for the first time, and I watched it at home. I watched it on a big telly, and then just before that scene, I've got a 12-year-old who's, as with most 12-year-olds, lives on a device, or half the challenge of parenting is trying to wrestle it off them. And he came in and watched and saw that scene, and like at first it's just like, oh, yeah, I'm talking to her mates. He is roaring with laughter at it.
Yes.
And it goes to something I want to talk to you about, actually. My frustration with films once they're like over 30 years old is they seem to be deemed as classics. And as soon as you make them all academic, it sort of makes them a bit too posh and a bit unaccessible. And what really struck me about The Rebel was just what an accessible comedy it is.
It is, yeah. And there's sort of references which were contemporary then that still feel contemporary now. For example, he goes into a coffee shop and he wants a cup of coffee with no froth. And the guy that's making the coffee, says, what do you mean no froth? I've spent, hundreds of pounds on this machine and you don't want any froth. And then he makes a coffee and he just hands it over and with no froth. Says, oh, it's not the same. So, I mean, that's, the explosion of coffee shops we've seen in Britain in the last 20 years or so. That could be referring to a scene now,
And a cappuccino, no froth.
No froth? That's right, no froth. Isn't that marvellous, eh? 800 quid's worth of frothing machinery here, and you don't want none. Otherwise, what you come in here for if you don't want any froth? You can get an ordinary cup of coffee anywhere. Isn't that marvellous, eh? Chelsea. Oh, it's the same. Ah, it's not the same, Al. One cappuccino, no froth.
And contextualising, was the television series just coming to an end as this film came out?
He did another series after this film, The Rebel. He had a very popular, well, I suppose we could call it a double act, and that's one of the reasons why it stopped. Him and Sid James, and people will remember from the Carry On films. The two of them would sort of co-star in Hancock's Half Hour, both on the radio and on television. And Toney didn't want to be seen as part of a double act, so eventually Sid was asked to leave, which he was very upset about. And the last series that they wrote without Sid James, contained some of the best remembered Hancock shows of all. The Blood Donor, of course, is the most famous one, the Radio Ham. The Home Alone one, where he's just a single performance on his own. Various other ones there. So the standard was still kept very high, even after The Rebel. But The Rebel didn't do good business in America. It got a terrible review. And when I did when the Blu-ray's coming out, and I did a sort of video interview on that, and I did a bit of research then at the time, and the critic said, "Here's another British comic as unfunny as Norman Wisdom." Now, I like Norman Wisdom, but you compare Norman Wisdom and Toney Hancock, just shows the depth of ignorance that is just mind-blowing, really. And I think sort of Toney was a contemporary Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers had made a film called The Mouse That Roared in 1959, and that became a big hit in America because it portrayed America as a benign world power, which is, just like what the Americans like to think of themselves as.
I was going to say, fill in the gaps there,
Yeah, So, but so Toney wanted to be the international star, but I don't know. I was able to tell Ray and Alan that because I'd found out that Stan Laurel had a Toney Hancock LP.
Oh, incredible.
So he was a sort of like, he lived in America, but obviously his British roots and stuff. So he got Toney Hancock. But whether the general American audience would get what Toney Hancock was about, I don't know, really. I suspect not. So that was reaching for something that may not have been attainable.
If only Stan Laurel had a TikTok account or something,
yes,
would have transformed it.
Yes.
The other thing that struck me about The Rebel is, for audiences familiar with Toney Hancock, outside of seeing him in colour, it's not a massive leap of character to accept him as. I mean, he is on screen as Anthony Hancock.
He is, yes, and I think that's sort of like, and he looks good as well. He's sort of like, he looks fit, he looks healthy. To have a colour film of him at this point, even if it wasn't a good film, it would still have a valuable historical interest. But the fact it's also a good film makes it sort of like an absolute must for any comedy fan to catch up with A, what Toney Hancock was all about, and B, how wonderful Technicolor can look, even though it was filmed 60 years ago.
I mean, you mentioned the response to it wasn't great. I mean, the metaphors in America wasn't great. The metaphor's almost in the film, isn't it? Where he loads his art onto a boat, sets sail overseas.
Yes.
And his art, I mean, it's a glorious physical comedy moment.
Yes.
But, I mean, accidental or just a kind of foretelling that this might not travel?
I mean, I don't know. I never spoke to Ray and Alan about how they thought it would be received in America. I remember that when I was first day of filming on the TV series I did with them, Ray and Alan weren't big on nostalgia. They weren't big on reminiscing necessarily. But on this first day of filming on location in Derbyshire, they started talking about how they were amazed they had George Sanders in their film. Now, George Sanders was a big Hollywood star from the sort of 40s onward. They remember as teenage boys, independently of each other, watching these films that George Sanders made, The Saint in London, The Saint in New York. I watched one of them recently. That they're not very good, but one of their boyhood heroes, one of their boyhood film heroes was there in their film, and they couldn't believe it. But the other thing that really surprised them was that George Sanders and his then current wife, they liked nothing better than to travel around East Anglia on a little scooter visiting antique shops, and they found this such an unlikely thing for George Sanders to be doing that whenever there was a break in filming, Toney, Ray and Alan would play this game. They'd say, do you know what George is doing now? And they would say, yeah, no, he's in the Hand and Racket in the Gold Hawk Road. He's reaching for the double top in darts, and he's just finished off a meat pie and jacket potato. And they were just amazed that they had this man in their film. And that was one of the few times when they ever sort of reminisced about stuff. They weren't sort of that nostalgic about things, And of course, their relationship with Tony Hancock after the last TV series that we just talked about, The Blood Donor and the Radio Ham and stuff. They wrote a second film script which he didn't like. Tony didn't like it, so he didn't want to do it. And they started writing a third one. He didn't like that. And their paths then sort of diverged. They never worked with them again, which was a real shame. But Tony was getting too much into it. He sometimes made wrong decisions.
There's one more thing on the Rebel I did just want to touch on, which is that there's a beautiful shot of a row of office workers with the top hats, and I looked at it and I thought, if Billy Wilder had shot that, there would be books written about it.
It's maybe slightly reminiscent of the shot in The Apartment.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote down. Yeah,
but I think it's sort of. I think they're both 1960s.
They're around the set. Yeah.
Yes, I suspect that somebody probably copied Billy Wilder rather than Billy Wilder seeing The Rebel, but I don't know. Who knows? You'd have to check the filming dates on those two films. There's a little project for people at home.
It's like Dennis the Menace, isn't it? There's a version of Dennis the Menace started in America at the same time as Britain.
That's right.
I'll play safe. And I'll just go with that. The second film then came out 2 years later in black and white, and I would suggest it's not as upbeat a film.
It's not a comedy at all, although it was publicised as such. And the poster says, Tony Hancock is rebelling again with reference to The Rebel. But no, it's not a comedy, there's very few laughs in it. I think if you approach it, and of course the way that we it's partly to do with our expectations. If you go into it expecting a sort of rather brutal, honest portrayal of a marriage that isn't working, of a man who's very unhappy, doing what he does, as a corruption of local politics, the fawning over sort of titled people, all those sort of things. If you sort of kind of expose of that, then I think there's a lot to enjoy within it. But it is certainly not a funny film, and it's not really intending to be. I mean, Alan Simpson said to me once, he said Tony wanted to be an international film star, so the next film he made after The Rebel was about a Punch and Judy man filmed in Bognor Regis. So it's not. It was never going to be a big hit. But Tony co-wrote this film, and he grew up, although born in Birmingham, he grew up in Bournemouth. So there must have been sort of seaside resort. There must have been a lot of his early life in there. But it's not a funny film at all. And it's interesting. Sylvia Sims is in it. She's always very good, as she always is. I think I'm not sure if it's a nephew, but it's certainly a relation of hers is the young boy that's in the scene with Tony in the ice cream parlour.
Oh, right, okay.
And Tony's had more time for that young boy than any other member of the cast, and he used to speak to him quite a lot. And I think that's because that young boy didn't know who Tony Hancock was.
Yeah.
Because I think there's, you don't want to psychoanalyze somebody, but I think part of Tony's problems may have been the fact that here he appears in things as, except in the Punch and Judy Man, he's got another name. He's on the radio as Tony Hancock, he's on television as Tony Hancock, he's in a film, The Rebel, as Tony Hancock, but that's a character, that's not him.
Yeah.
So maybe when people come to meet Tony Hancock, who's got the same name as the man on radio and screen, they're expecting to find somebody as witty, as funny, as lovable as the alter ego that's also called Tony Hancock. Nowadays, comedians always write their own material. That wasn't so much the case back in those days. Certainly Frankie Howerd never wrote his own material. Tony Hancock never wrote his own material. Peter Sellers never did.
Yeah.
So it was quite common for comedians to employ writers to supply them with material. So Galton and Simpson supplied Tony with all this fantastic material, but then when he gets rid of them, they're impossible to replace because essentially they're the best writers that any comedian's ever had. You'd have to put them up with Eddie Braben and Morecambe and Wise. You know, it's so well suited. And I think what happened was in the early days, because if you listen to the very early Hancocks, he's got a different sort of performing voice. It's not quite the relaxed, natural voice we get to hear. And when I used to spend a lot of time with Ray and Alan, I'd sometimes hear them sounding a bit like Hancock. And I can hear bits of Hancock in what Ray and Alan said and bits of Ray and Alan in what Hancock said. So I think the three of them became very close for a while. And I think this character, because they would sometimes take lines that he said in a pub and put them into the script.
Yeah.
And I think that character became a kind of a mixture of the three of them. And I think that's why the writing is so perfect for him, because they all understood who that character was.
The perspective of the character's still familiar, isn't it? I mean, he positioned himself in the TV show, in The Rebel and the Punch and Judy Man as the working class man up against the machine to a degree. He's puncturing the pomposity of the art world in The Rebel.
Yes.
And the Punch and Judy Man, as you say, he's angry about a lot of things.
Yes.
And so you talk about people interacting with him and expecting Tony Hancock. I wonder if that's part of it as well. They were expecting the person on their side.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, it's, you can imagine if it was sort of, if, for example, Steve Coogan, if Alan Partridge was called Steve Coogan. Yeah. That people would assume that he was the same character as he appears on screen. So I think there must have been a lot of people would expect him to be funny, and I don't know if he necessarily was that person. I mean, obviously I never met him, so I don't know whether he felt a pressure there to be the person that people thought he was.
I read a line on the Punch and Judy Man, which in a few places, and I mean, because not a film well received at the time, it's described as the film made when Tony Hancock sacked his writers, and it's the film that nobody likes.
I wouldn't say it's the film that nobody likes. I'd say it's the comedy that nobody laughs at, might be a better way of putting it, because it's still in 63, you've still got one of the biggest comedians in the country. It's his second feature film. Yeah. You're going to market it as a comedy. But I know there's a lot to enjoy in it. I think the performances are strong. It's a very strong cast. Like a lot of films which are filmed on location 60, 70 years ago, it now also has a social interest, because you look to see how people dressed, cars of the time, what a pub looked like, how much a pint of beer cost, all that sort of thing. That social history stuff comes into play when you're watching something that's of an age. So no, I wouldn't say it was a film that nobody liked. I'd say it was a film that people were completely disappointed by, because, as I say, if you approach it as a comedy, you're in trouble, because it's not that.
I will say, though, the bit where they are in the pub in the Punch and Judy Man, and he's kind of looking through the wall and flipping the tiles round is brilliant.
Yes.
I mean, there are, as you say, there are comedic moments in it, but I mean, the construct of that I just thought was terrific.
And it's sort of like this, and I talked about this in the piece to camera for the Blu-ray release. Going to see it with my mother, and I remember there was a point, and I just remember this point where my mother suddenly sort of stiffened and she'd seen something on screen which hadn't pleased her, and I didn't know what it was, being a very young boy. But later, when I saw it on television, there's a moment very early on in the film where he's going past the mayor, and he lifts his hat up, but he puts two fingers to lift his hat up. So he's clearly doing a V sign as he lifts his hat up. Now, the Tony Hancock character on radio and TV, particularly on radio because it's visual, but you would never have expected him to do that. Yeah. And it's a real case of a comedian sort of kind of almost losing his audience at that one point there. That's when they suddenly go, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't the same man. This isn't the man that I found funny for the last 10 years. This is something different. Why is he doing that? And I remember my mother sort of just reacting to that. And it was only, I remembered the moment by looking at the screen and wondered what she was, but didn't know what it was until I saw it years later.
And yet, at that point in his life, he was still enough of a draw that you mentioned Bognor Regis. They put out a call for extras. And was it 2,000 people come to be extras in a Tony Hancock film?
I mean, this is only a couple of years after the tremendous success of the last TV series, The Blood Donor, and all that kind of stuff. And The Blood Donor became one of the most famous half-hour comedies that we've ever produced on television. People still quote lines from it who are of a certain age. They will say, when the doctor says to him, when he says to the doctor, he says, how much blood do you want? He says, nearly a pint. I want a pint. And he says, a pint? That's very nearly an armful. And Ray and Alan told me, and they talked about in interviews as well, how they spent some time trying to, what was the right line? Should it be that pint? That's almost an armful. Is that the right word? And then very nearly they realised in the end was the right sort of poetic phrase for it.
The other thing that struck me about the film is it's a silent film for quite a while.
Yes.
And obviously you've written extensively, you've made television programs about silent film, but the art of that, the framing of that at the start.
Yeah, I mean, it's nicely done. Hattie Jakes, who was a co-star on the radio series, makes a very brief appearance as a sort of favour to Toney, as a sort of fortune teller, I think she is. And the whole sequence in the ice cream parlour where him and the boy are having a sort of like the ice cream sundae, that's quite sort of visual, and there's not much dialogue, if any dialogue, in that. It's a strange film. It is an odd film, and it's the last time that sort of Toney starred in a film. He only starred in 2 feature films. There's another film from the 1950s called Orders Are Orders, which has a great cast, but it's an awful film. Peter Sellers is in it, Tony Hancock's in it, I think Sid James is in it, but it's only of historical interest. There's no entertainment in it. The Punch and Judy Man is his last star in film. He appears in a few other films as the 60s progress. He's briefly in The Wrong Box. He's briefly in those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. But that's kind of it then.
You mentioned the ice cream parlour, and I wrote down after I'd watched it, it's the most passive-aggressive serving of
yes,
of an ice cream sundae or whatever it was I've ever seen in film.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a long list.
No.
But I'm sure I could dig in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of anger in the film. It's a very angry film. And this is quite interesting because there's a scene very early on in an antique shop when he gets hold of a bunch of flowers and shoves them up a pig from behind. Now, when that film was shown on TV, or indeed when the previous DVD release was there, and I had that, and that moment wasn't in the film. And in the DVD release, neither was the moment with the lifting the hat with the 2 fingers. That wasn't in either.
Interesting.
So that had been edited. Those 2 bits had been edited out. And I remember at one point thinking, well, I know that because I remember getting the DVD and watching it a long time ago now. And thinking, well, I know that the 2 finger thing should be there, but that's not there. And the pig, I was sort of thinking, I'm sure that happened. And I couldn't, I thought maybe my memory's playing tricks. And I looked up a couple of stills from the film, and there's a still of him doing it. So I thought, well, it must be there. So when the BBC showed the film, it was that print they showed. So somebody somewhere along the line had cut those 2 little bits out. Perhaps because they are so out of character from what we expected from Tony Hancock that maybe somebody somewhere thought they were doing him a favour. I don't know.
It would be one of the most bizarre examples of the Mandela effect if your personal was flowers going up there.
I've got a good memory for this stuff, so I knew it had been there. But I know when I checked the still, and I thought, well, that I've not imagined that. The pig and the flowers is definitely something that should be in there.
Perhaps it's reflective, though, of how the Punch and Judy Man is revered more now. That DVD came out, the DVD format was end of the 90s, so it was still being censored then.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fairly contemporary for a V-sign to be taken out of it.
Yeah, I don't know who did it. I don't know whether it may have been... Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Would it have affected the rating of a film, just to take those 2 bits out in 1960, when it was released in 63, when it was shown on TV? Then you had a rule that a film could be shown 5 years after its initial cinema release was the deal.
As opposed to 5 minutes.
5 minutes, exactly. So then that would have meant the film was released was available to release in 68.
Yeah.
Which was the year that Toney died. So maybe, I don't know. Maybe somebody thought, well, to make it suitable for family viewing, maybe cuts were made. Maybe those tiny cuts were made then. I mean, I don't know the history of that, and it'd be interesting if somebody does know, to tell the world.
I mean, rounding these 2 films out, I watched them in reverse order. Mm-hmm. I just picked one, and I did the Punch and Judy Man first, and then the Rebel second.
Yes.
I do wonder if that's affected my response, because I didn't go into the Punch and Judy Man necessarily expecting a full-on Tony Hancock comedy.
Yeah.
I think if I'd have watched the Rebel first, my response to the Punch and Judy Man would have been different.
What did you think you were going to watch? A comedy or?
I've been a Tony Hancock fan since I sat with my dad and watched them, so I assumed elements of that. But the scene is set very, very. I was very quickly disavowed of that.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't take long to tell you that's not what you're getting.
Yes.
And I'm used to that watching comedians in films now. I'm in a context where seeing a comedian take a dramatic lead isn't. I mean, Peter Sellers' best film has arguably been there.
Yeah,
I'd suggest, and I mean, he's not particularly funny in it.
No, it's not really a comedy. It's a very good film, but it's not really a comic film.
Yeah, but also, it's really odd to me that the black and white film came later, and the one that looks modern and fresh came first.
Well, I mean, black black and white films were still very popular in the early 60s. You know, Billy Liar, that's a black and white film. That's the same period. I think probably we're now thinking about it when colour TV started over here, which I suppose would be mid-60s, late 60s, maybe 68, something like that. So once colour TV's on, I should imagine people, you know, thinking, okay, well, there's no point in making a black and white film if people can sit at home and watch colour. Yeah. So that maybe that might have been the reason why black and white got phased out. So you weren't expecting a comedy. So what did you think at the end of the Punch and Judy Man? Did you think that was one of the worst films you'd ever seen?
Oh no. But then I think that's where modern eyes help it enormously, because I'm not watching it in the context of the height of his fame. And as a Birmingham person who's familiar with him, I know how dark his life was getting towards the end. So what I got was not particularly a surprise. In fact, images from it have really stuck in my head, but it's been a week. So maybe in 6 months I'll see if they're still there. But it's a really impressive piece of work.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. As we said, it portrays a failed marriage, a bitter marriage. It's a sort of a very unhappy man. So if you approach it, I would not... I suppose it doesn't really matter whether you watch the Punch and Judy Man first or the Rebel first. Yeah. As long as you go into the Punch and Judy Man knowing the kind of environment you're going to be in. So it might be good to start with that, because the Rebel is a much happier film, so maybe you want to finish on a happier film. But
also, I got that delightful comedy moment in the Punch and Judy Man as well. I really loved that piece in the pub.
Yes.
I just thought that was wonderful.
Yes.
So summing these two films up then, I mean, you've done a lot of work, you've done commentaries on these films, you knew Ray and Alan as well. How would you capture those films now? As someone listening to this who's never even considered watching them, perhaps, what are your thoughts through your modern eyes?
Well, I would say then on that basis, if you're too young to remember Tony Hancock, I would start with The Rebel then, I think, because that is the much jollier, funnier film. It's just, approach it, with open eyes, and don't expect to be funny in the first 20 seconds. I don't think it's a slow film, but I think the idea of, the commuter, you see commuters, getting off at the stations and stuff, and everybody's looking a bit grim because as they go off to work on a Monday morning, knowing they've got 5 more days of it. The Rebel starts with a man who doesn't want to be a commuter anymore, who wants to do something else, who aspires to be a great artist. And I think that's a sort of a human quality that's very much still around, that we want to be able to escape the prison of a 9-to-5 job and perhaps find something that's more creative and more fulfilling. That's basically a human need, I think. But often we get jobs which we have to stay with. I got a job in the civil service when I first left school, and I left on February the 29th, 1980. I waited for the leap year day to come round, so I'd never forget the date. The idea of 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the intervening years is rather scary. So in a sense, I sort of did what Tony Hancock did in The Rebel, and I gave up a job to fulfil artistic ambitions.
Well, long may that continue as well. Paul Merton, thank you so much for joining us. You have the finest socks of any guest we've ever had on this
Indeed, I am. It's a pity I'm only wearing socks, but there we are.
Well, knees must, radiators up, right?
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Rebel and the Punch and Judy Man are available on STUDIOCANAL's Vintage Classics label on both DVD and Blu-ray from the 3rd of March 2025. Just time then for a bit of quick news from the world of STUDIOCANAL. Coming to cinemas then on April the 6th is The Most Precious of Cargoes, a beautiful animated feature from Michel Hazanavicius, the director of The Artist. In this haunting World War II fable, a poor woodcutter and his wife taking a baby they find abandoned by the rail track, changing their lives in ways they could not foresee. At home, meanwhile, Paddington in Peru is out now on DVD, Blu-ray, 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray and digital, the perfect family treat. Dig back too into the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast archives, and you can hear our behind-the-scenes tour of the film, where we got to confirm a little detail about Paddington's passport. Fresh from cinemas, We Live in Time, starring Florence Pugh and Andrew Garfield, is celebrating its home premiere, and it's available to buy and rent now on digital platforms. DVD and Blu-ray formats will be available to purchase from the 24th of March. Finally, Pablo Larraín's Maria, starring Angelina Jolie, is also available to buy or rent now via digital platforms, And there's a DVD and Blu-ray coming of that as well. That one's due on the 31st of March. I'll be back soon with the next episode of Studio Canal Presents. Until the next time, to get all the news on Studio Canal films as it happens, and to find out more about the ITVX, Apple TV and Prime Video channels, you can visit www.studiocanal.co.uk or follow Studio Canal at Studio Canal UK on X, Instagram and TikTok. For now, I'm going to try my hand at a bit of sculpture. I hope I fare better than Toney Hancock. Ta-ta for now.